Terrific. Yeah, really excited. I mean, great to see so much energy in this space from the previous presenters, and really excited to share what we're doing at Policy Engine. My name is Max, and I'm here with my co-founder, Nikhil. And I thought we could start just by, I'll give some background on OpenFisca US, Policy Engine, and turn it over to Nikhil to give a demo using an example of a household with a single parent, disabled child, and then also simulate changes to some of the rules. And he'll also show some of the demo on the code side. And then I'll close out by just sharing some of our next steps and future vision. So our mission, we're a nonprofit, and our mission is to compute the impact of public policy for the world. So we're aiming to be a computation layer for a wide variety of tasks that involve tax and benefit analysis, and to make that as accessible as possible. So our app is free and open source. You can go to policyengine.org to see it. And it's built atop OpenFisca, as well as we really have benefited from a number of other projects, including a few that have been discussed today. As many of the presenters have done, we start with the legislation or some other data source to understand what the rules actually say. And we, similarly to MITRE, we connect that to survey microdata and also to administrative totals. From that point, we use machine learning to actually enhance microdata. So we grab other kinds of data sources, put them all together, reweight them, and then we build our microsimulation model based on the legislation and OpenFisca. That's all on github.com as well. And then we put the front end interface on it. So that's what you see at policyengine.org in both the US and the UK apps. We can answer pretty simple questions from Policy Engine, things like just, am I eligible for free school meals? But we really get pretty complex. So we can evaluate intricate reforms. We worked with the UK Green Party on their 2019 manifesto, which included a huge slew of tax and benefit reforms, everything from a carbon tax and land value tax to a universal basic income and a number of other tax reforms. So we were able to simulate this policy on any household that enters their information, as well as on the UK overall in terms of the budgetary impacts, poverty, all that kind of stuff. And to give a demo on how that looks, I'll turn it over to Nikhil.
Thanks, Max. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see this and hear me okay. So if you go to policyengine.org, then this is what you'll see. So this is the web app that we've built, aiming to let people compute the impact of public policy. So I'm going to go on to the US calculator, and this brings us a web app with 3 main pages. And the first one that we're going to have a look at is the Your Household page. So this essentially lets people plug in the details of their particular household and then simulate their tax and benefits using our open source model. So for example, I'm going to describe a single parent with a disabled child and see what the tax benefit system looks like for that parent. So we've got a sort of menu of options here on the left. We can input details about their location, such as their state, their expenses at the household level. So I'm going to give them $600 per year of broadband expenses. And then we can actually provide different variables for each person. So I'm going to give the parent, let's give them about $10,000 of income. And then we'll go to the demographics page and input for their dependent, their disability status for SSI. So with that, we can actually go straight to the calculate your net income button. And this is going to go and query the open Policy Engine API with the given household information we've described, and come back with all of their benefit and tax simulation results. So we can also break this down into its component parts, so we can see which benefits are contributing how much to their net income. We've got SNAP, free school meals, Lifeline, the ACP, and SSI. And then we've also got taxes, including state tax and federal income tax and payroll tax. So the other part of this is, of course, not just this particular situation, but how does the tax benefit system actually respond to your income if it changed? So this is needed to understand things like welfare cliffs or marginal tax rates. And so essentially what we're doing is just mapping out, if you vary in employment income from the left to the right here on this chart, how would your net income look? And so this picks up a few interesting results. For example, we know that this household is worse off at particular points if they took a pay rise because of the welfare cliff effects of losing benefit entitlement. And then we can also see essentially the inverse derivative of this graph, which is the marginal tax rate chart. And this tells us where the really negative marginal tax rates are, mostly from non-refundable credits, and where the really high marginal tax rates are from benefits like SSI. But of course, the other angle to this is the policy reform angle. So if we go to the policy page, we've got a different sort of menu of options, and we can pick and choose which policy parameters we'd like to simulate changing. So I'm going to make the child tax credit slightly more generous. We'll make it have a refundable component that phases in a lot faster at 100%. And then we'll also change some rules around SSI, and we'll make that a bit more generous by increasing the maximum amount. So we'll take that to $1,000 a month. So we've got our reforms sort of outlined on the right here, and we can go ahead and calculate that for this particular household. So if we go back to this net income table now, it's going to go and calculate their alternate scenario if they were under this reform and show us the difference against the baseline. So we can see how their net income changes, how their benefits change, and how their taxes change, and break down each of these in exactly the same way. We can also see the change to the earnings chart that we showed earlier and show how the tax benefit system responds to earnings, both in the baseline and in this reform scenario, to understand what changes to maybe work incentives that can be pretty dire in the current system with high marginal tax rates. So we can see this blue line is the new reform, and we can outline the difference and show at which earning points you are getting the most benefit from this reform and how quickly that disappears with earnings. So of course we can see the marginal tax rate changes. With cliffs, you tend to see marginal tax rates tending to positive or negative infinity, but mostly it's a bit of a mixed picture in terms of what the marginal tax rates change for this. The other part of this is not just the individual household calculator, but also the US impact. So using the microsimulation model, for any given reform that we can simulate on one household, we can simulate on tens of thousands in survey data. And this gives us the ability to show what is the net cost, how much does poverty fall by, who comes out ahead or behind. So we can see for every reform, the breakdown in the budgetary impact, the poverty rate changes. We can see that this one is very progressive, but also that even within those income deciles, we can see what percentage comes out ahead and strongly ahead. And then finally, we can see changes like on income inequality. So of course, this is the web app, which is the kind of front end of this. But we've also got the behind the scenes work going on in the API and the model itself. So we've got an API Explorer that lets anyone search for a particular parameter and see some more detailed information about how this integrates with our microsimulation model. So we've got the current value of this SSI parameter, as well as the references to the law that actually back this up. And if we go into the code of OpenVisca US in the Policy Engine GitHub organization, then we can see the parameters that define what it looks like on Policy Engine in a policy page. So OpenVisca is a really nice framework that lets it be really easy to describe parameters over time. So we've got the SSI parameters from 1975 up to current day. And we can see all the metadata here, and this directly powers the Policy Engine app or any other app that might want to use the model. As well as parameters, you've also got variables in the OpenVisca ecosystem, and these are particular attributes for a particular entity that take some computation to figure out the answer to. So for example, this variable tells us, conditional on being eligible for SSI, what is the maximum amount? And for that, we look up the SSI parameter, the one that I just showed, and we check whether the SSI claim is joint or not. If it's a joint claim, we take the capital amount, else the individual amount, uprate it by the number of months in the year, and we've got a reference for this as well. So those variables and parameters define how we calculate things in Policy Engine, but we also need to check that we're actually getting it right. And how we do that is by designing example scenarios and checking that we get the expected results. So for some cases, the Code of Federal Regulations can provide some really useful information. For example, this is directly from CFR, and it tells us an example where for Henry and his family, which have different income sources, what is the expected countable income for SSI? And so with every model change, we rerun this test to make sure we're getting the expected value from that documentation. So then finally, we've got some documentation for OpenVisca US, and this mainly consists of code samples that generate graphs and show how to interface with the model directly. So it's all in Python. And so this particular code sample generates a graph that tells us how SSI phases out for a single person, depending on their social security. So this is mainly to both show how to interface with the model and also identify how these programs actually work and react to different circumstances. So with that, I will hand back to Max.
Great, thanks, Nikhil. So that's sort of where we are today. We have a number of other projects in the works. So we're actually partnering with the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University to bring this model to all 50 states. We'll have state income taxes and major benefits in all 50 states and DC within the next 1 to 2 years. We're also enhancing the survey data for microsimulation. So all those machine learning models I mentioned before, we've done that in the UK and we're bringing that to the US. We are also working on a number of other benefit programs, as well as a different kind of experience that makes it more like the apps that our users use in other contexts. So we want to have a sign-in experience. You can save your household information, save your policies that you've created, make it more mobile friendly. It does work on mobile today, but it could be even better, as well as even more macroeconomic dynamic modeling. We think we can have this really power all the policy use cases that hopefully policymakers would think of, and of course, outreach. But really, we're hoping to reimagine policymaking to be more democratic. So imagine you subscribe to some policymaker, and every time they come out with a new policy, you get a notification saying, here's how this policy would affect you, here's how it would affect the overall US, and you see that in a feed. You can see feeds like that from policymakers, from think tanks, from random individuals, and you can also modify the kind of policies that are being proposed. We want to make that experience possible, still having all the detail that you showed or that you saw today, being able to craft policies from your device, see all the kinds of policies that organizations have put forth. So that is where I will close, and looking forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you both so much. We got a lot of discussion going on in the chat. Chris, I'm going to call you out and see if you want to come off mute and ask your question. But I will start with one that you responded to in the chat already, Max. But it was, how is the budget calculated? Is it purely benefit amount, or does it attempt to estimate things like admin costs as well? And that's from Krista Hartsock.
Yeah, so essentially the way that works is we currently just have the direct cost to households. So everything sort of ties together in the survey data. Every policy reform is going to affect a certain number of households. We then look at who that is in the current population survey, and then we take a weighted aggregation of that to figure out the budgetary impact, as well as similarly the poverty impact and all that. We would definitely like to add overhead costs in the future. For example, I think a lot of, SNAP, for example, has about 10% overhead. Some other programs are significantly higher or lower than that, and we want to show that.
Thank you. Next question. There's a couple of questions in the chat, but I really want to hear the answer to this, which is, what motivated you to model both taxes and benefits?
Yeah, I think these are really two sides of the same coin. Taxes are, and a lot of households pay taxes and they get benefits, and those both contribute to their net income, sort of those charts that Nikhil showed, as well as their marginal tax rates. These govern their work incentives. So low-income people today face very high marginal tax rates in many cases. Something like 90%, I think, is what Nikhil was showing for the parent of a disabled child. And that means if your wage is $15, your actual wage is about $1.50, right? So the way that we can show that all together is to show the payroll tax, the tax credits, maybe the actual other income tax forms, and the benefits and how that all fits together. And also have a consistent experience for people at the low end and the upper end. We want to, and everyone in between. We believe that if you have one app that serves all those use cases, it can start to level the playing field more in terms of service delivery.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Chris asked a triple question. So I'm gonna read it all, but I can also break it up into chunks. But he said that the discussion of impacts of policy brings up a related question. How do we predict how much work it will take to bring this new policy online? Are you or any other presenters able to speak about at all predicting the time needed to code a policy? And he says he guesses that's the point of rules as code, but it seems like there's still a need for development in many, if not all, of the presentation. Big question.
Yeah, I mean, Nikhil, do you want to talk about this? Because I think the Open FSCA model in general is trying to think about how this gets integrated into the policymaking process, and the UK might be farther along there. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely difficult to predict the complexity of like individual benefits or taxes when you start tackling them. I think actually what we found in developing out the US model is by separating out into different states that tend to have a sort of similar level of complexity, that can be an easy way of getting a sort of benchmark for how long it takes to do one particular thing. In the UK, we have just sort of almost completely national benefits. So that's usually just like one big benefit usually takes the same amount of work as each other one. But yeah, I think it's just a matter of benchmarking the complexity of the legislation against what we've already done and kind of interpolating between what we've already experienced has been the strategy that I guess we've been using the most.
I would also just add one thing, which is we are starting to code up some policy proposals. So for example, if you go to policyengine.org/US, you'll see that there's one bill, which is from Representative Rashida Tlaib and Mondaire Jones, actually, called the End Child Poverty Act. And we have modeled the special parameters that are required to implement that policy. So our goal is to have that before it gets into law. We sort of are building out the policy and seeing the impact. And then hopefully that makes it more seamless once it comes to fruition.
Thank you so much. Chris responded in the chat box, but I will ask Mary Pat to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, this is really exciting stuff. I really appreciate the demo and the information here. Question for you is, I was taking a look at the policyengine.org site on the policy part of it, and see right now you've got Massachusetts is the only state government in your drop-down list. And I'm curious, what's the process for iterating and adding additional states?
Yeah, Massachusetts was the first state we did. And that was really somewhat arbitrary, but we also wanted to do a policy paper on something that came out in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So we are now working on, let's see, Maryland, Utah, New York. This is really based on discussions with our partner, the Center for Growth and Opportunity. But we're still in the process of prioritizing all that. So if you have reasons we should go your state first or something like that, please let us know and we'd be happy to consider it.
Thank you. One other question I will ask is, can you expand on the data enhancement portion that you spoke?
Yeah, so the data enhancement is kind of pretty mature on the UK side, so I'll speak a bit about that. But essentially what we're doing is going to be similar in the US. What we do is we take the original survey data, so a good standard household survey like the current population survey, and then we essentially just reweight that using an optimization process called gradient descent, where because it underreports high incomes or underreports low incomes, we apply some change to the original weights in order to get closer to a whole collection of administrative statistics like population totals by region, or income tax or benefit totals by region as well. So we aim to move the survey to be closer to being consistent with those estimates, and that's the approach that's worked for us in the UK. And then we also impute values from other surveys. So for example, from wealth or consumption surveys, we essentially build a model predicting from the variables we have in common, what are the distribution of values for a particular wealth variable that we're looking at, and then impute those values over to the original household survey so that we can, for example, evaluate changes to things like student debt policy or consumption taxes.
And for the US side, the specific data sources we'll use, we'll continue to have the current population survey be the source, the home base sort of our analysis. We'll also impute data from the Survey of Consumer Finances, the Consumer Expenditures Survey, and also add some extra data from tax records in the IRS public use file. So I think this unified data set, we hope, will be valuable not just within Policy Engine. Of course, everything we do will be open source, including that data set. So we'd be really interested to see that used for other research purposes as well.
Thank you. And for the last question I have, thinking about like the society-wide impacts of like the reforms and how you can estimate how these policies will impact society. Can you talk about any like challenges or limitations that you've come into? And then also wrapping us up with what's next for Policy Engine.
Yeah, well, so right now everything is static. So our model assumes that nobody responds in any behavioral way. There's no macroeconomic feedback effects. So you would expect, for example, if you had a reform that smoothed out some of those welfare cliffs, that could actually be pro-growth in some ways, encourage people to get into the labor force. On the other hand, there's reforms that could go the other direction. So we're excited to add some of that. We actually just did a paper for a conference last week that made some headway into using elasticities that come from the Congressional Budget Office to estimate those aggregate impacts. But actually, I think there's a lot more we could do on broad general equilibrium macroeconomic modeling. And to do that, you have to have a model that isn't just the current year as we show, but time, over the next decade or even next 50 years. So we will be adding extrapolation factors to our model to enable that kind of analysis. I think those, in addition to the sort of interface improvements and the state tax and benefit policy, are the main things we're currently working on. But interest and feedback from anyone, I'll actually drop our emails in the chat as well.